welcome back. Give yourself a few seconds, settle in, let your to-do list go for just a little bit. Let yourself focus. Hi, welcome back. Trying something a little bit different today. I'm going to stand and let myself move around a little bit. Lecturing while sitting is not really something that I'm used to, so I'm hoping that this helps me get a little bit more into my teacher vibe, which I feel better about. But anyway, so we're trying something a little bit different today. Wrapping up, well, I called this natural selection wrap up, but really we're going to be talking about natural selection the entire semester. So this kind of wraps up this one little focus section where we're introducing natural selection and following up on Dr. Smith's guest lectures on natural selection. I just want to make a couple of quick points about natural selection. When we're talking about natural selection, we can kind of think about this or use imagery of this toy. This cylinder that we're looking at has a bunch of different colored balls up on the top level. This where we see the red and the purple. It may not be, all of the colors may not be super obvious yet because they're all crammed into this very top level. And then these little areas that I just circled in white, they're the bottom of different levels of this cylinder. And you may notice that there are sort of these little white circles that are darker in the center. So those represent holes. This first level of this cylinder has quite large holes. Because it has quite large holes, then many of the balls are able to fall through the holes into the next level. Same thing with the next level and the next level. And finally, what happens is that we get all red balls at the bottom of the level, the last level of this toy. The purple balls were caught at the first level, green balls at the second level, and then the yellow balls at the third level. You're thinking, what on earth does this have to do with evolution? Well, I promise it does. It illustrates a really important concept. We notice at the bottom level, we only have red balls. And so if we use this cylinder as a metaphor for selection, what was selected for is this bottom layer of balls. And it's fairly quick. You can fairly quickly notice that they're all the same color. They're all red. But what actually selected for these balls was not color, it was size. And so this is this sort of concept of selection for or selection of. What the heck do I mean by that? In this example, this very simplified, we're using a toy example. What was selected for? When we ended up with only red balls at the bottom, if we're using this as a metaphor for selection, was red selected for or was size selected for? Okay, so you probably very quickly thought, oh, well, the little metaphorical cylinder is not selecting for the color, it's selecting for size. So what was selected for was actually size. In our metaphor here. If there had been yellow balls that were this size, we would have gotten a mixture of red and yellow in the bottom. But if we just take the end result and we don't know what the selection mechanism was, like we do when we're studying evolution very often, we see all red balls. And so what we sometimes want to do is we want to ascribe some sort of attribute, some sort of feature to the color in this example. So we want to think the color must be what we call adaptive. The color must attribute some sort of difference in fitness, right? So when we talk about natural selection, it's any consistent difference in fitness among different classes of biological entities. So we have different classes. We have purple balls that are very large, green balls that are sort of medium, yellow balls that are small, and then red balls that are really, really small. And in this example, size was what was actually selected for. And in selecting for size, color, sorry, it took me out of my presentation. Color, the selection of color happened. So size was selected for because size is what actually allowed the balls to pass through to the bottom level. Whereas the selection of color also happened as a result of this process. It wasn't color that actually was the feature that produced a difference in fitness. And so this is just something to keep in mind as we're moving through and discussing natural selection, discussing types of evolution, how evolution works, that an organism has so many different characters, so many different potential character states, and that when we're just looking at an organism that is the result of evolutionary processes. Not all of those features are necessarily what was going to be selected for. Okay, so moving to, no, I'll do it on this slide. Just a couple of thoughts in selection 4. So a feature that we see may have been carried along. And this is just like my way of saying it. So in this example of the color red, this color red is linked to the size of the balls. And so this feature was kind of carried along with the size, which was actually selected for. And then another important thing to realize is that a feature may have side effects that aren't actually selected for. So let's imagine that, I don't think I can stick with the balls example here. So an organism has some sort of feature that gets selected for. Maybe it's a color. They get selected for being dark in color. And the environment then becomes very cold. And because they're dark in color, they're able to better absorb heat. And so their entire species is better able to survive because they are all darker in color. Selection didn't select for the survival of the species. Selection selected for darker color. So these are just kind of some nuances, and I want to introduce these now and have these kind of turning around in your head so that you're thinking critically as we're moving forward and talking about natural selection. So we know that this is not one-dimensional, not even remotely one-dimensional. It's incredibly complicated, as I'm sure you already knew and suspected. Another important concept when we're talking about evolution is something called neutral evolution. We tend to think of evolution as something that's churning forward, that's driving towards something, and that's not the case at all. Sometimes evolution maintains the status quo, and a good example of this is sharks. We see what we sort of consider what we would recognize as the shark body form appear as far back as 370 million years ago. And if we fast forward to modern time, that body shape has hardly changed at all. So in this case, evolution has maintained the status quo. Where evolution isn't driving towards change, evolution is actually eliminating, natural selection, I should say, is actually eliminating things that would change the body form to maintain that form. Another example that I brought up in earlier lectures is the lamprey. This is a the mouth of a lamprey, and the way lamprey feed is that they latch onto the side of fish and they use these teeth to then bore holes in the fish and essentially eat the fish that way. The lamprey body form hasn't changed since the Carboniferous period, 359 million years ago, when we first see, actually it wasn't the Carboniferous period, I apologize, that was sharks, that was the Carboniferous period. So lampreys are even further back. This is when we first see jawless fishes, further back, way back before sharks. This body form, this shape, the way that lampreys look hasn't changed since we first see jawless fishes introduced into the fossil record. And here's just another image so you can see kind of what they look like from the side. So what we're seeing here is what we might consider neutral evolution, and where natural selection is eliminating things that would change this body form, things that would change this organism. And another important thing, see if I can, remember how to do this. Okay, I'll do it on this side. Another important thing to consider is that, and we'll talk about this a bit more when we review genetics, is that we have neutral alleles. There are lots of places in our genome where there are different alleles. But those alleles, one allele or the other allele, so allele A versus allele B, they don't confer, there's no difference in fitness. So we may see shifts in the genomes, we may see shifts in these allele frequencies, but because these are neutral alleles, then there's no consistent difference among different classes. So classes that have allele A as a homozygote, allele B as a homozygote, classes that are heterozygous, there's no change in fitness. So these would be neutral alleles. Okay, last kind of little caveat when we're talking about natural selection is this beautiful concept that used to make my head hurt so bad. It took me so long to wrap my mind around this. This is genetic drift. And we're going to spend an entire chapter on genetic drift. We're going to get into the weeds about genetic drift. But just to give you a little overview, and then we're going to watch a quick little video from the Amoeba Sisters. They're one of my favorite YouTube channels. Very simple, a little cartoony and silly, but I love it, and it helps you understand the concepts. The concept of genetic drift is all about randomness. Natural selection is the opposite of random. Natural selection means things that have better fitness, things that have differential fitness, pass on their genes at a higher frequency. So this is probability, right? Randomness is genetic drift. And so an example that I really like of this is if we had, oh, it didn't work. Okay, so we have our population here of beetles. My animation didn't work. I even drew a foot and everything. Okay, so we have a population of beetles. They're hanging out in a group, and for no reason, not because of anything about the beetles, there happen to be more green beetles on what is the top of your screen than there are blue beetles on the bottom of your screen. And some person comes along and they step, my other drawing was much better, with their big foot on this part of the population, right here. And they kill most of the green beetles. They killed most of the green beetles, and so we end up with a population that has many, many more blue beetles than we do green beetles. That changes the genetic and allelic frequencies of the population, but not because of any feature of the organisms. It wasn't that the person stepped on the green beetles because they could see the green beetles. It wasn't because the green beetles were slower than the blue beetles. It was completely random. And so genetic drift is when we have a change in the population due to random chance. Nothing to do with their actual features, their characters, nothing to do with conferring fitness. That's genetic drift, is random change. And later, when we talk about, here in just a bit, we're going to talk about something called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and genetic drift is one of the things that can influence Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, here's the website so that you have it. This is the next thing that we're going to watch, is this little conversation about genetic drift from Amoeba Sisters. And remember that later in the semester, we're going to come back and we're going to spend some serious time on genetic drift. Next, we're going to do a little genetics review, because genetics is foundation of evolution, mutations review, and then we're going to dig into Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium.